Welcome to the first official Media Roundtable of 2024. There's been so much anticipation around this year. Many of our greatest dreams or fears may be realized. There's a lot changing in the world, globally, nationally, locally, everywhere. And certainly 2023 has been an active year for the audio industry. And we spent a lot of time in December looking back and trying to unpack and just make sense of all the changes that happened. Well, it's a new year, and now it's time to look ahead. And fortunately, I have a friend. By the way, this is Dan Granger. I'm CEO and founder of Oxford Road. If this is your first time tuning in, welcome to the Media Roundtable. We are always creating content in service of the chief audio officer, the people that have to make audio work as an advertising channel for their brand. And so in December, I brought on a friend to help unpack everything that happened in 2023, because there was just so much. And the industry is changing so quickly that we needed help breaking it down. So we brought Steve Goldstein on, and we looked back and then we said, you know what, this was such a great conversation. If he was willing, that we would try to have him back in January to do a look ahead, maybe make a few predictions. Then at the end of 2024, we can look back at this and say, okay, were we right or were we wrong? Because we do like to present our report cards publicly on this stuff. Steve actually wrote a nice recap on through his newsletter, which you can find at amplifimedia.com, looking at the ups and downs of 2023. It was a blog post that essentially recaps our last episode. So if you want to start with something bite-sized before you go listen for an hour, great place to start. Just a refresher on Steve, who's going to be joining us. He's the founder and CEO of Amplifi Media and an internationally recognized executive and leader in the audio space. He has scaled ventures across podcasting, radio, satellite, and voice platforms. Steve launched Amplifi Media in 2015, and it is an audio advisory firm today that guides clients through strategy, content development, organizational efficiency, and content discovery. I can give you a lot of specific examples, but he is very thoughtful about his where he discloses and drops names of all the fancy groups that he works with. But I promise you, he's worked on some of the biggest projects that you've heard about in our field. Also, Steve is the first person to launch a legit college course around the business of podcasting at NYU, of all places, where, look, I was never somebody that would be qualified to set foot on the grounds of NYU, but Steve let me in, and he let me speak to his class, which was a fascinating and wonderful experience. But I think, listen, if anybody literally teaches a class on this business, you're about to hear from him. And we're so glad that you're here, Steve, to share your knowledge and your assumptions about what's about to happen here in the next year. So welcome to the Media Roundtable.
Well, it is good to be back in the Media Roundtable here in 2024. But as we both know, predictions are dangerous, but we'll go there anyway.
Yeah, if I want to do a new business meeting where somebody says, show me your predictions from last year and see how they shook out. The fact checkers can have their way with us. But you know what? I think that we've actually been surprisingly accurate with this stuff, and we're usually batting at least 500. I'm sure you go further than that based on everything I've seen you putting out. Before we get into the specific predictions, couple just odds and ends I wanted to cover with you. You know, whenever we do this show, whenever we go anywhere, we're talking about audio. We know it's roughly $36 billion international business, $18 billion in the US. Podcast is approximately $2 billion of that in the US this year. So maybe a hair over 10% of the pie. Why all the hype around podcasts? How come for every time somebody says audio streaming or radio, they say podcast 100 times, even though it's the smaller channel? Why all this obsession?
Yeah, it does seem that it is overweighted, but it's been steady growth, and the growth recently I think is greater than it has been over the past 8 years. So we're talking about up fourfold since 2014. What other audio segment is up that sharply? But the stat that I keep thinking about is the growth of spoken word. And spoken word used to be like, 20%, 80% music, 20% talk. Now we're at a third. And most of that, or more than a third of that, is going to podcasting. So that 10 is going to be 12, and then it's going to be 14. And you see the radio number coming down. So I do think 10 is hard to get excited about, but I think the trajectory is pretty awesome.
Well, it's interesting. And, as I've tried to think about it, there's only so much you can do playing somebody else's music, right? And I know that the business is all about what you put in between the songs when you're not running advertisements. But on spoken word, it's everything. And I think that, when content creators, they kind of unchained them by not binding them to these FCC regulated signals that had to, compete to get the top share in their market. They got to fan out and start creating content for anybody and everybody. We all did, right? Which is why we've got so many millions of podcasts. And that's the renaissance that was very buzzy and attracted in so many people. When a few people started making money, everybody heard about it, rushed in. And I think we've had this compounding hype cycle that now 2023 was like sort of the backlash of that. But what I wonder is, can you look at podcasts, and as podcast goes, so goes the audio industry? Is it safe to use that as a barometer for the whole ecosystem?
No, I don't think so. I think it's all parts and components. Um, you know, radio is getting softer, commercial radio, linear radio, AM, FM, whatever you want to call it. Streaming growing, podcasting growing. But, as I mentioned, spoken word growing, I think that's the exciting catalyst that didn't exist several years ago.
Yeah. Switching topics to something completely unrelated. So one of the things that's fun about having a podcast is that it gives me a chance to talk to people about things that have real life application that normally I just don't have an occasion to talk about. And I thought, since you are such a seasoned and expert consultant in the space, maybe we can workshop a podcast problem that we have as creators right here in real time on the Media Roundtable podcast, which is, people hate the music that we use for this show. I don't know. I ask people all the time for feedback. Well, what do you think? Feedback's a breakfast of champions. Tell us how we can do better. Every single time I get constructive criticism, they say, I hate your music. The music sucks. Now, frankly, anytime I change anything, a website, something else, I hate it as soon as we're finished. So I always want to change it immediately. But I feel like that's just me. In this particular case, the market has validated my self-talk, and I think we need to make a change. I don't know where to begin, and I'm overwhelmed by the whole process. What would you do?
Well, so I'm gonna jump on the pile. Yeah. It's just
Really
it's
hate
not
this
as
music.
contemporary and cool as this agency is. And so when you think about branding your audio,
Yeah.
you want it to have a beat and some sophistication and some pacing. I think that's what you should look for, and I'm going to help you.
Will you?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Happily.
Well, I
Happily.
would love that help. I say, when I think about the brand that we've built, we want things that are classic. We don't want to just chase fads and trends and, have something that's going to sound lousy when you listen back in a few years. But I probably didn't need to go back like 200 years in the soundtrack. That may be too classic for our own good. So, all right. Well, maybe we can have a secondary conversation about that, which will or won't be broadcast on our podcast feed. But thanks for jumping on the train. Okay.
However, by the way, my phone,
yeah.
the ring on my phone is Beethoven's Fifth. So
there you go. That's what I'm saying
as well.
Like, let's get something in the public domain that still holds up. I don't know. You'll have to guide us on this one, because frankly, I've just got a lot of analysis paralysis on this one.
Bring it on.
Okay. Last question before I'm going to start asking you for predictions. There's a lot happening in the world, as as referencing earlier. War in the Middle East, presidential election, which does not appear like it's going to be any more mild for the country than the last couple go-arounds that we've had. How do you think that these big, weighty national and international events and news stories, economic news, how do you feel like that is going to impact the business that we work in of audio in 2024?
Well, it's fantastic. I mean, for the obvious reason that it's changing and people need perspectives and they need thought and they need it from people that they trust. And I don't think they trust the sources, or the other sources aren't as available as they used to be, print, for example. But the ratings on CNN and all of the other, cable news networks, they're down sharply right now. I think people are sort of in that lull and they're not paying attention. But I think that's also a medium for 62-year-olds, 65-year-olds, and podcasting in particular has been able to talk to people that are substantially younger. And that's a void that's been filled. And I don't see that evaporating in this crazy market that we live in where everything is changing every other day.
So you're bullish from the standpoint of consumption will be up, particularly on news and current events channels. And I agree with you. It's like the new whistle stop tour for presidential candidates is a podcast, right? So they're starting to recognize the influence of the medium. But I do wonder, look, we could scenario play the economy, but nobody knows. But we do know that things are going to get contentious politically as well. And we saw and felt, I think, the effects of radical polarization with the last election. That's a big part of why we started this show to begin with and really focused on that. In our world, that translates into things like brand safety and suitability. But, I fear for our clients who I think they're going to turn up the heat on the scrutiny that brands face for who they affiliate with. And while the audience may be growing, that doesn't mean it's necessarily safe country. So any thoughts on what we're up against when it comes to brands going into these spaces where there's still so much of a brand safety concern?
I think it's really tricky. I mean, the Twitter X example is so significant, where advertisers who even went back in now had to jump out again. And so how many times are you as an advertiser willing to risk your brand on that platform before you turn around and say, I can go buy around you. I don't need you. I can go do other things. And I think that's what's going to happen, certainly in podcasting, cable news, whatever it may be. There's no more mass audience, so you can buy around anything.
You can, and I think, I'll just share my experience on this one because it's been impactful. Where there are some marketers that are like, I was talking through brand safety and suitability, and what's available to a brand, what tools are out there. Talking to a big company, like think Fortune 100, and I said, have you ever been in a situation where it's kind of like damned if you do, damned if you don't? And whatever you buy, you're going to have to face a ton of scrutiny over it. Somebody's going to have a problem with it. Like, this is my whole life. Like, their whole job is dealing with this. In audio, in fragmented channels. Audio is just an example of it, but anywhere you've got an open ecosystem with user-generated content that you can sponsor, and you're supposed to sponsor influencers, it's impactful, but you don't know what the influencer is going to say, do, what people think about them, what they said before. And the biggest problem we've had, I think, functionally, let alone the societal implications, is that we see people wiping out either broad swaths of content. No news dictates, no conservative dictates. And so, the the bump that you're talking about, because of the relevance of things like the election, that should increase consumption, also increases complexity for brands. And my perspective is that we have been in kind of the 1.0 stage. Like you talk about the MeUndies stage of podcasting, we're in like the earliest stage, which is now concluding, I believe, in brand safety and suitability, because it's been very binary. It's been either based on keywords. So, if they talk about this topic, we don't want to go there. Now that's very lacking with nuance. And then the other problem is, if you actually look at some of the tools that are advertised as AI driven and contextual, the false negatives and false positives coming out of these things that brands are using will make you cry if you actually look under the hood on some of them and see shows that get taken out of consideration for reasons that are either false, inaccurate because the machine couldn't do it right, or it's just guilt by association because you said the word Israel or whatever, right? So I'm concerned about the kind of secondary challenges that brings. And I wonder if, 2023, even though there was still a lot of polarization, if it was a lull or the calm before the return of the storm. So I don't know what that's going to be like, but that is a concern that I have going into this year.
Yeah, I think it's a legitimate concern. I think it's a real concern, but that's a sponsor-driven issue. For listeners, they're going to seek out this content.
Totally.
They're going to find it. And those who are reliable and trustworthy and don't need to, go too far, I think will benefit. And people need them. People need those voices.
Yeah. Well, and last thing I'll say on the issue, I'm just going to do a plug for our partners at Seeker, because, when everybody uses GARM, and if you try to do brand safety and suitability as a brand using the GARM suitability, safety and suitability framework, you're going to blow your brains out. It's going to make you nuts. It's absolutely unruly to try to apply very specific standards. And it's very hard for tech to do it in a way that you can just close your eyes and trust. The civility score so far, and we just launched it a few months ago with Seeker, it's been able to cut through the keyword problem and actually get a lot closer to sentiment. So, for example, the comparison would be one person's system might show the Office Ladies podcast, and it shows that it's really violent. There's a lot of glamorization of violence, which you can imagine, right? And then with the civility score, it's like, no, actually, it's a high civility on this show. They're actually very respectful people. Well, why does the violence get flagged? Because they're always talking about what happened on a shoot. They were shooting this, they were shooting that. And the tech is just not sophisticated enough. I've talked to publishers that talk about they can't get sponsors for basketball because when they put in their brand safety standards through programmatic, it kills the word shot. So you're done with sports effectively.
Or if you have a bomber jacket.
Or if you have a bomber jacket, yeah, the ways to screw this thing up are manifold, and so I'm happy to say that as a result of this program and the work that we've been doing, we're starting to move into the 2.0 era where we can look and actually get a better sense of context by not just focusing on avoidance of nouns or misinterpreting those nouns. But I think that's where we have to continue to move as an industry, for it not to completely obliterate the opportunity that happens when important things are happening in the world. So anyway.
And trusted brands.
Who
have a history.
Yes. Okay. Well, thanks for letting me derail on that. Shall we get into some predictions? You ready to do this?
Let's go.
Okay. So first one, and listen, the good news about this section of questions we're going to be making predictions on, you're not the first to weigh in on them. We had some highly esteemed journalists who follow the podcast beat that also weighed in on these things. And there's only total consensus on a few of them. So wherever you go, you'll be in very good company when we publish the results. So 2024, let's just start with audio listenership in aggregate. Up or down?
Up. Easy up.
Up. You want to make a call on that? How much you think will go up?
Oh, I have that I don't know, but I'm going
I
to go
wouldn't
back
either.
to what I said to you
I would
before.
never want somebody to ask me that question.
I'm going to go back to what I said about spoken word.
Uh-huh.
That is up sharply. And so that's exciting without jumping back on my own
And
little
we
bandwagon.
well, and I do like that. Let's just go down that rabbit trail for a second. You were talking about that when you say up sharply. Do you mean that on a year-over-year period, or is that looking at like in the last decade?
That is over a couple of years,
Mm-hmm.
but um, I think I think the momentum is in the past few years. This is Edison data,
Yep.
easy to pull up, but I don't have it in front of me.
Okay. All right. Next prediction, 2024. Revenue, advertising revenue in the audio industry, up or down?
Well, you would know better than I, but it feels very up, and we're talking about streaming also.
We're talking about streaming also.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm gonna vote with you up as well. We're both up and up so far. Now the next one is a little more complicated, and we can get into the channel nuance. So we have shifted over time in what we define the key slices of the audio pie as, but I like to use podcast, radio, and streaming. And then whether it's satellite radio, that fits into radio. If it's pure play versus simulcast, that's all streaming. If it's smart speaker content, we're calling that streaming right now too. So will CPMs, and if you want to speak by channel, I can give you a prediction by channel. Will CPMs be up or down for advertisers across podcast, radio, and streaming?
So in the short term, I don't know. I mean, there certainly is a lull. You've talked about this many times, and how much of that is based on an overabundance of mediocre content. And what happens? Does the market flush that out? In which case, I think the CPMs can go back up with higher quality content. Um, but I think that's dynamic. However, when we compare it to our old industry, meaning you and me, where we started, the CPMs in streaming and in podcasting are pretty attractive.
Yeah, for sure. Well, my prediction on this one is it's going to go down in aggregate because radio still has so much
In
ground
aggregate.
that it's going to lose, right? And so I think radio goes down. I think streaming goes down in part because I think this whole pixel apocalypse, pixelgeddon, whatever you want to call it, I think that that's a real threat, and I think that's going to create challenges and strain. It's going to require brands to pull back a little bit. I know there are a lot of advertisers who we've seen scale in the channel. Would have never happened if we didn't have pixel-based attribution for streaming. And so as that gets challenged, I think that's a big threat for that slice of the pie. Podcasts, I think, will be up. I think, we got the industry got humbled a little bit in 23. I think 24 that picks up.
You also have an X factor here with SiriusXM moving into streaming. Let's see how that goes. Of course, they have AdsWiz. They have a lot of power, but maybe they're too late. I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, we've seen consumption change fast. TikTok didn't have a problem finding scale, where competitors had failed or there were already incumbents. YouTube, as we've seen with audio, just eating that out of nowhere. So, yeah, I could see that. That's definitely on the table. So, all right, let's talk about content investment. This one might be a bit of a layup, but I think that we can agree that the amount of money invested in content creation, whether it's talent deals or actual hard costs associated with production, the content investment went down in 23 over 22. What do you think is going to happen in 24? Up or down?
So I think that's a more complicated answer. I think that there was a lot of overspending. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of mediocre content. So you had a lot of dollars chasing really bad ideas or mediocre ideas or undifferentiated ideas, whatever it may be. That feels like a lot of where that spending went. And so I think that that's the change factor we're going to see in 2024. I think people are going to be more judicious about what they launch.
No doubt. And we were just having a conversation a couple of weeks ago on the content manufacturing piece. Now, I think it's probably safe for us all to assume that the expiration dates on the minimum guarantee deals they made during the pandemic, as those keep expiring, they're going to convert those minimum guarantees to larger rev shares, lower guaranteed payments as often as they can get away with it, right? So I think we know the investment's going to come down in that way. But the other piece of it is, I think we're seeing so many cutbacks with things like docu-series, mini series on podcasts where there was heavy investment. They were really creating durable, evergreen content, but it's tough to monetize on a short-term basis. And a lot of that stuff's going away. And, the piece that I'm always fearful of is the radioification of the podcast space where, we're going towards more disposable content that's cheaper to produce and mass produce. And we're kind of, when we start getting podcast zoo crews using sound effects and, being wacky and wild, like that's when the whole industry has jumped the shark, right? But I fear that we're kind of moving in that direction where there's going to be a lot more chat, a lot more just soapboxing, and we might see less people taking the risks that cost money to take. So I don't know.
Well, scripted series has always been more expensive, but it hasn't done all that well. I mean, if you really look at it, and you look at it through the lens of 3 or 4 years ago, when you had a lot of Hollywood influence, you don't see that anymore. And that may be because these things were ridiculously expensive and the appetite for that kind of content wasn't that great. So, yeah, I don't think everything ends up as a chat show, but I do think lower production costs are essential.
And what about the investigative journalism piece? Would you put that in the same bucket as scripted?
So I think that's a limited pool of people who are capable of doing that, just as it is on TV. It is expensive. It can be amortized differently, but I don't think that is easy to get into. That is rarefied air.
Well, and maybe that's the lesson from the last few years, is just that there's a market, but the market is not an infinite market. And so, there's going to be an HBO, there's going to be, a Netflix that's investing more, not literally necessarily, but there's going to be groups that will continue to focus and do really high quality stuff. But you can't have everybody that wants to do it or could do it and still have everybody make money. The pie is only going to be so big. So hopefully the quality just keeps getting better and better. We just have fewer titles to choose from.
Well, look at Netflix. They released the results of their audience over the past year. There weren't that many hits. I mean, there really weren't. There was a lot of content that did okay. I think that parallels podcasting pretty closely. A couple of major hits, a lot of stuff.
Yeah,
but keep
no
in mind
doubt.
one other thing. Podcasting is much more niche based. You have a lot of content that doesn't need a mass audience. It needs the right audience.
Well, it's so much cheaper to manufacture, even though you can spend a lot. As you and I have discussed before, you don't necessarily have to. All right, so tell me if you've ever heard of any of these companies. Indeed, Shopify, NetSuite, Headspace, Quip, Theragun, Postmates. I'm not only the host of the Media Roundtable, but also CEO of a company called Oxford Road, and we are the world's leading independently owned and operated audio ad agency. And what that means is that we help great companies, many that you have probably heard of on some of the other podcasts that you listen to, We help them test and scale campaigns in audio channels, with podcast being one of those leading channels. Some of the work that we do includes media planning and buying, as well as analytics, attribution, and insights. And we also have a very special way that we deal with creative and copy generation. We have our own proprietary process called Audiolytics that allows us to score ads for their persuasiveness. If you're looking to be involved in audio and you want a partner that can help work with you to make sure that you achieve unprecedented ROI and massive scale, you should get in touch with us at Oxford Road. And by the way, the only reason that we're able to do the work of the Media Roundtable is because we have a great team at Oxford Road that supports us and makes it possible. So, what we're doing is not just a podcast, but we're really trying to help brands live out their values and balance that with their business objectives, which is an increasingly hard thing to do in this world of misinformation and malice that's infecting so much of our media. But at Oxford Road, we don't want to just broker this stuff. We want to impact the industry for good. We want to raise the bar on what gets created. And Oxford Road is helping make that possible through the Media Roundtable. So if you're somebody that's interested in working with an ad agency or a partner on this type of work for your advertising campaigns, go to oxfordroad.com. It's easy to spell. And get in touch with us, or at least just sign up for our free newsletter, The Influencer. That's oxfordroad.com. All right, let's go. We in our last conversation, we talked about AI, and I think we talked about it as a retrospective. But looking ahead, here's how I want to frame the question. Do you believe that AI will do more harm or more good for the audio industry in 2024?
So in the short term, I think there's going to be a lot of experiments. I think they're probably mostly not going to work. I think that there's a reason that authenticity was the word of 2023, because everybody is nervous about AI. Okay. And listeners are not an exception to that. But people also respond to humor and spontaneity and warmth and conversation. Those are things that don't easily fit into AI. Now, there may be plenty of opportunities or scenarios where you could have an AI hosted show, but I will bet you, this prediction I'll come out on, that by the end of 2024, you will not see those shows in the upper tier.
I would not disagree with that. I would back that completely. I think, I think. So wait a minute, is your vote negative or positive?
My vote is there's going to be a lot of noise and a lot of experiments, but at the end of the day, it is not going to change the sound of podcasts.
So between harm and good, maybe you're more in the neutral camp. It's going to happen, but it's not going to be that big a deal.
Right. But ultimately, like any other trend, I mean, these things grow, they grow, and then they fail.
Yeah, I'm gonna call harm on this one. I think it's gonna do more harm than good. I think that the parts that are great about AI are the parts that nobody's gonna talk about, which is how it makes back office processes more efficient.
Beautiful.
So people don't have to do repetitive tests. Yeah, love
Spend
that.
your time on that.
Nobody's gonna talk about that. What they're gonna talk about is the junk mail they're getting through their feeds. When everybody can now manufacture infinite, content and there's a bit of a guessing game. I think it's unclear about what the expectations are for how much disclosure has to happen. So are we going to see a lot more a rise of audio deepfakes? Possibly. I think that's more of a nuisance than anything else, but where I think it gets genuinely problematic is when respectable names and voices start lending their credibility without disclosures. I think that's going to be a real pain point in this industry. And we're going to have to hit our head against something, I think, before we decide we need to deal with that. I want to make more noise about it sooner so that we can hopefully do some preventative care. But I think that when people are manufacturing content and you don't know who's voicing the ad, if they're really voicing the ad, if they're voicing the show, or parts of the show or not, and you get one person saying the wrong thing that they didn't even know they said, you could have a real scandal here. And I just think the trust that could chase out of the industry is actually where the real liability is.
But you're already seeing this happen. So like there was that incident with Sports Illustrated where the AI created the content and it wasn't verified. And you're going to see the envelope pushed on all of this stuff. But I think that's where we are. I think that's exactly where we are at this moment.
To quote you, that maybe AI is actually in the MeUndies stage, right? Or MeUndies was pre-experimentation. Now you say we're in phase 2 now.
Yeah,
in the stages of
spaghetti against the wall was phase 2.
So now we're in the spaghetti against the wall. Okay, all right. So you're going neutral. I'm going short on that one. Next one: industry standards and practices. Standard definitions, standard expectations of what you're going to receive when you do business in the industry. We see rules that are different from publisher to publisher on stuff that in radio is pretty well understood and standardized. I don't think we have real standardization here. For us, it's a challenge. For brands, I believe it's a big challenge that they may not really be aware of, but it's a big problem that we're trying to sort out in the middle. Do you believe, if you even accept the premise that this is a problem, do you believe that our industry will become more standardized or more chaotic in 2024?
I think it's a really good question, and I sort of feel like we're at that chaotic moment, and it's not just what you talked about. I mean, God, I see this all the time where we have this huge issue of the RSS feed and what's a podcast and YouTube and the channels. But that's where we are in the business. We're just trying to figure it all out. It's a baby business growing up, and all of this stuff is not surprising. It just isn't.
Well, but are we getting better or are we getting worse?
I think we're getting smarter. I really do. Okay. And hopefully we're getting more flexible. I mean, on this RSS thing, I mean, I don't care about the RSS. Fine.
I only care so much as that I think even if I don't agree with where everything lands, I want it to land so we know how to move around in this place and we don't have to speak a different language with every person we talk to.
Yeah, and we may have mentioned this on the other podcast, but I think about this in TV terms, that it used to be simple. NBC broadcast a show and it went over antennas and people watched it, and then cable came along, and then it morphed yet again, and now we have apps and we have streaming and we have YouTube, and this content is not on a simple dashboard, and it is not monetized the same way on all these different platforms. But that's part of chasing audience. And podcasting is now going through this evolution where it has to figure out whether audience has to look just like an Apple or a Spotify app or whether it can be something else.
Yeah, I feel like another way of what you're saying is just like, yeah, change is messy sometimes.
Change is always messy.
Yeah. And I think that's a fair perspective and a reasonable one. I think just as a practitioner, I think we spend more time stubbing our toes and trying to deal with minor issues that could be sorted out that just aren't yet. And so we'll stay in that messy middle, that sophomore phase for a while, but I'm going to bet that it's going to get more chaotic before it gets more organized. I think we are more aware. We are getting smarter. We're getting more aware of the problems, but I haven't seen a movement that can really consolidate everything and point it in a clear direction so that we can start to solve these issues.
100%. 100%.
But I think, we know some folks, and I think we're involved in the industry, and I think eventually we'll all just sit down and sort it out soon enough. Okay, let's move on to some of the other topics. So those were the standardized ones that others have asked. I'm gonna just start firing the rest at you. What's gonna happen to radio in 2024? What are we gonna look back and go in the last 12 months?
Yeah, look. Radio is a melting ice cube.
Yep.
And the good news is it takes a while for that ice cube to melt. And there's $10 billion of revenue in the business, and it is not going to
Mm-hmm.
evaporate tomorrow. But I don't know what the catalyst is that can cause growth there. So I think it will continue to hemorrhage if they don't introduce younger demographics, which so far they've not been successful at. I think it's going to continue a downward spiral.
But
Spiral's a little too harsh.
if people stop using the recession word this year, and we've got election money coming in, is it possible that we see a dead cat bounce and there's a perception of growth or actual growth that suggests there's future growth when we know that there's probably not?
So we work with a large radio company, and we're doing digital transformation with them. And what is digital transformation? That means we don't expect a whole lot more headroom out of radio commercials. So how else are we going to impact the local advertising environment? And it's with other tools and other tricks and other, platforms. And so that's a reinvention of radio, just as newspapers, just as TV are going through it. So is radio, or radio must.
Yeah, we could do another episode about this, because I think I have an idea of where local is going, but it's nowhere near it right now. And I think it's like we talk about news deserts and, the death of every, legacy publication in every small town. And it has to be reborn at some point. We're just not seeing that yet. All we see is decline, but what we don't see are the seeds that are going to start to bear fruit.
There is money.
In the
There is
decade
money
ahead.
in the local environment.
It's necessary.
The difference is that advertisers are no longer saying, I need to have a 30-second, 60-second radio commercial. They're saying, I need audience. I need traffic in my store. And that can come from lots of different places. And so that's where radio needs to get smarter. And it is getting smarter, but it's taken a long time.
Well, they have economic burdens that I think may preclude many of the establishment players from being able to compete.
You have
in
too many companies on the edge.
Yeah.
And they've been on the edge for a while, but their notes come due in the next year or two. So
Yeah. So
we'll
they
see what
keep
that
saying.
Well, something's gonna break, right?
Okay. Content creators going multi-channel. We've talked about this a lot, but I'd love your predictions for how you see this playing out in the next 12 months.
If you're not multi-channel, you're not servicing your audience and ultimately your revenue, but audience first. And they are multi-channel. You must be multi-channel. It's really that simple.
Yeah. One day I want to have you on the show with Sky Pillsbury. She was on our December show on the panel, and she said a part of her dies every time somebody calls a vodcast a podcast. And I think I'm squarely in your camp. And I told her before, and I'm like, do you mind if I disagree with you when we're doing the show? Because I'd like to argue about this a little bit. But yeah, I think we can get too caught up in that stuff. And I agree with you. Let the audience tell you what to do.
The listeners are always right.
Listeners are always right. Okay. Will Congress protect AM radio in new cars?
So I don't know what the current percentage is of AM radio penetration. It's got to be 5%, 7%. I mean, it's just shrunk over time. There's this false equivalence that emergency coverage occurs on the AM band. Most of the news departments and AM radio stations are gone. There are exceptions, plenty of exceptions. But the notion that AM radio is essential is also a listener function. If it were that great, it would have a bigger share. Now, having said that, it used to be cheap and easy to have it in a car. I'm not quite sure why you can't keep it in the car. I am not advocating that it be left out of the car, but it's just shrinking and shrinking.
So I would vote. I would say that I think it's likely Congress will help, only because I have such little faith in the judgment that we see out of Congress. But I agree with you that it's like, do you really need to try to get a small win that's gonna be a temporary incremental win, and you want that win on a technicality? Like, does that
Yeah.
really have? Don't we have better ways to think about the future than
Hey,
trying to?
how about going deeper on podcasts and streaming? I mean,
Yeah.
let's deal with audio and video and other forms. I don't know.
So they can get Congress to protect the buggy whip, but I think it's time
Yeah.
to
Yeah, I don't see any
time to move on.
legislation where Verizon is trying to protect phone booths.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Okay, let's talk about um, dynamic audio, which I went big into dynamic audio in 2019 and was too early. It wasn't time, and so I'm kind of sitting on the sidelines with like a toe in. uh or at least we are at Oxford Road. We continue to engage, but in a limited sense. But I know what the possibility is when audio becomes interactive through two-way speakers, right? With smart technology. What do you think is going to happen in 2024 on this front, if anything of significance?
So when you talk about dynamic audio, you're talking about interactivity. You're not talking about the fidelity, right?
Yeah, nobody cares about fidelity.
Yeah.
I don't
That's
think.
no, the MP3 has settled that issue. And your AirPods aren't particularly great quality, but they are convenient as hell. So
Yeah.
okay, so you're talking about interactivity with advertisers. I don't think it'll ever happen. I just think the notion that people care that much about interacting with an advertiser is unproven over time. And there are a lot of companies that have spent a lot of money. But if all you're offering is 10% off a pizza, forget about it. It's got to be something that people really want. And I think radio people, by the way, have learned that cash is not a motivator on contests like it used to be. But getting Taylor Swift tickets, that's more significant. So what would I do? Would I do something with an advertiser or with a radio station or a podcaster for something I really want? Yes, maybe, but that is rarefied air.
To me, I think the long-term opportunity is the choose your own adventure model, when I can have my show or the parts of my show at the length that I want. I can switch the communicator. If I say that I want to listen to if I want to have Snoop Dogg reading the part of Prof G, I can do that. Like, you can, like, I think there's going to be fun ways to customize it and bells and whistles, but I think ultimately you're going to get to hear about the things you're most interested in with the time that you have, and be able to go different directions with it. I don't know if that's a multi-decade thing or if that's just a couple of years away, but
I think history has shown that default settings are called default settings for a reason. There's a lot less customization because people don't have time, they don't have interest, it's too complex, there's a lot of friction. So there's always an audience for customization, but mostly people don't do that.
so wait a second. So let's say I listen to Rogan, and what are his shows? 5 hours long. I mean, they go on forever, right?
Yeah.
And I go, okay, well, Dave Chappelle is going on Joe Rogan, and I'd love to hear that conversation, but I've only got 32 minutes according to my navigation until I'm home.
Yeah.
Can I not say I play the 32-minute highlight version?
Yeah, I
And
think that's great.
like, do you?
Fine, fine. So that's markings within a show.
Uh-huh.
Look at TikTok. People are watching TV shows on TikTok. They're
Yeah.
watching segments of TV shows. They're watching comedians on TikTok a lot, right?
Yeah.
And so you're just harvesting 4 minutes, 6 minutes, 8 minutes. So that's customization, but it's a different kind of customization than you saying, okay, I got to figure out how I'm going to get to that Chappelle piece.
Yeah, I think to the extent that they can make it intuitive, but these things will happen in time. I'm not going to make any predictions for that for 2024. I don't think we're there yet,
Too
but
early.
I think
Too
it's
early.
going to happen. I really do think it's going to be interesting, and I think we're going to get things more the way. I mean, it's almost like The bad side of it is like filter bubbles. You only get the information that you want to be fed and the perspectives that you want. That's the downside. But I think the upside is you can get the kind of content, the subject matter material. Oh, I'm interested in this person who's the interview. Can you play a few more interviews that person has done that are popular? Like I think you can do a lot there. And I'm going to stay bullish on the advertising front. I really do believe that if I'm doing something where I need to stay hands-free and I can't click the link to the website and go search, if you can answer a few questions for me dynamically and I can just purchase with my voice, I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity there.
And you'll see that the tools, the Alexas and the Siris, are going to become a lot smarter, AI powered, and so that will be on the table.
Yeah. So, all right, let's go into our final section here where you and I both have some predictions, and I'm going to share a few of them with you and just let you react. I think that we're moving up into the right as an ecosystem, but I think that certain things have to get worse before they get better. So I'm predicting that we're going to see cracks in the infrastructure in a louder way. We're going to hear more about the limitations of the first version of brand safety tools. Pixel attribution is going to have a lot of challenges. Ad serving technology is there's more awareness. And the next thing that happens is you get pissed because now you're aware of the limitations. And then when you're mad enough and dollars start to go away, then we start to fix it. But I think we're in the stage where that awareness of the problems is going to get louder. Any reaction to that?
I would just say that 5 years ago, none of this stuff existed. And we've come pretty far, pretty fast. But I don't disagree with anything you just said.
Now, you had a few final predictions, and the first one was about public radio. Can you say what that's about?
Yeah, sure. So public radio is suffering just as commercial radio is. Listening is down. One number I saw was 6%. Revenue is down. I mean, NPR was off $30 million. You see cuts at WNYC in New York, and you see them at LAist, and you see them in public stations all over the place. I also see retrenching in an area that just is a head scratcher. The public stations built the podcast ecosystem. They were the first in, and they did a great job. And now you're starting to see comments from companies like NPR, WNYC, that everything has to be broadcast first, which is counterintuitive to the way things are going. Also counterintuitive to the way the audience has gone. They are not attracting younger demos, so they're aging out, and they're going to put the more youthful shows on broadcast. And would they be discovered by the younger audience? It's a head scratcher. So I think they've got an identity crisis in parallel to commercial radio. Different factors, but pretty closely aligned.
So is that going to just result in a smaller pie for them, and it'll be the same model, but they'll need to consolidate and cut to right size to reality? Or do they need to reimagine how they do business?
The latter. They need to reimagine the whole thing, and they
like maybe the whole not-for-profit thing was cool for a while, but maybe it's time to switch out of that type of thing.
Well, I think about my friend Jarl Mohn, who was running NPR and really built out. He paid attention to the broadcast side, but he really developed out the podcast side, where the revenue was not constrained the same way that the FCC constrains broadcast stations. So it felt like it was on its way. It felt like they were ahead of their time. So I don't know where they end up. The other thing is that the product innovation needs to occur. The shows that were popular 10 years ago are, in essence, the same shows as today.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. And I mean, I think one last footnote on the last topic is that you can look at OpenAI as a great example of going from nonprofit to to wildly profitable.
To changing the model, right?
Yeah, for better or for worse, existentially. So yeah, let's talk about the crowding. What do you think about the fact that you got the same shows year over year on the top charts? What does that
on the
mean?
top of the podcast charts. So
A little bit
it's
discouraging if you spent tens of millions of dollars on your big idea.
Totally. And so of course there's comfort. I mean, by the way, look at the TV ratings. It's mostly sports shows and 60 Minutes that's sitting up there, and that's been that way for a long time. So I don't think that's different. I just think it makes it harder when only 3 of the top 10 shows at each of the Edison, Triton, Podtrack charts changed out over the past year. Yeah, that's quite frustrating. That's top 10. So you go deeper. But you know, there's segments like true crime that seem insatiable today. We'll see.
We'll find the ceiling. We'll find. It'll happen. It'll happen.
Yeah. It feels like it's got to happen. Meantime, NBC, a television network, has 5 of the top podcasts. In the top 20, I believe it is, that are true crime. My goodness.
Well, we need our soaps. Then okay, but so what's the prediction? Do we see more of the same in 12 months, or do you think there will be a change and more diversification?
I do not see any factors that would lead me to think that it's going to be greatly different a year from now.
Agreed.
Right. Next.
Final subject, the pan media overbuild. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, okay. So we, in podcasting especially, overbuilt and underperformed, which is why you're seeing a lot of companies retrench, and some more will go away.
Yep.
In the coming year. I think that's a fairly safe prediction. But I think about this in terms of not just podcasting, but look at streaming. I mean, AMP, which was a big effort for Amazon, was in and out in 20 months. Yeah. And, Twitter Spaces, and, I mean, there are so many initiatives.
Remember Clubhouse?
Remember Clubhouse? Boy, what a horrible experience that was. But yet the timing was right, and it was all different reasons during the pandemic. But, so there's a lot of overbuilding and a lot of underperforming. And that's because hits are hard. It's just hard to make things work. If it were easy, you and I could pile on tomorrow and make all new stuff. And that goes back to the discussion about the top of the charts being as steady as they are, because hits are hard.
Hits are hard. All right. Well, good news is we're playing a long game. And for anybody that wants to stick around, we should do the same. Everybody that comes in looking for the quick win doesn't stick around for long.
You see it.
Such is life.
And look at TikTok, by the way. TikTok in on podcasting and out in podcasting before they even,
I can't keep up.
Product.
Right. I can't keep. Are they out again right now?
They'll
be back. They'll be back in February. It'll be fine.
But they probably
they'll be out by April.
25 articles about how podcasting is over, and
okay.
Well, maybe we're too late.
Yeah, it's over for sure. All right, go ahead, guys. Move along. Speaking of being over, this hereby concludes our prediction episode for 2024.
Boy, you're a good host. You could do a morning show.
You know too much to say that to me. I appreciate it. I'm going to try not to take it in. But thank you for that. You are a wizard, good sir. And I think and anybody who will hear this in the future and read our excerpts will agree that you've got a great perspective on the industry, and we would do well to take your counsel and to subscribe to your newsletter. Do you mind plugging that a little bit? How do they get more of your action?
Amplifi Media, AMPLIFI media.com.
It sounds so easy when you say it.
I know, but it should have a Y, and it doesn't. It's got an I on the end.
All right. Well, these are our predictions, and now that they've been recorded, we can't do anything about it. We'll let you know how we did in another year. So stay with us. Thank you again, Steve. You made a great contribution. We're going to keep having you back as often as we can get away with it. This podcast is brought to you by Oxford Road, where we still want you to succeed in audio, and we want you to use your influence for good. As members of the marketing community, we have the power to advance voices that don't just entertain but edify, and to rise above our differences and show that collaboration is possible when we treat each other with respect. We'd love to hear from you. I told you we like feedback. You can tell me how much you hate our music until Steve gets us something else. You can send us your feedback or suggestions or questions at info@mediaroundtable.com. If you're a chief audio officer and you're looking for a partner to help you achieve best in market performance and maximum viable scale, reach out to our ad agency, Oxford Road. We specialize in this stuff, hence the podcast, by visiting oxfordroad.com. Subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. Special thanks to Kyle, Bianca, Haley, Scott, Mary Jane Everett, the team at Podcast One, everyone I'm forgetting. And as always, influence responsibly.
And I have one more prediction.
Let's go.
You will have better music in 2024.
Let's hope. Your lips to God's ears. Let's go. All right. Thank you, Steve.